Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
The forest is never really quiet. You have to know how to listen. And then sounds inevitably appear. A bird flutters from a bush, a branch rustles, the wind caresses the tops of the pines with its palm. These are all signs that the forest is not just bushes, trees, woods. It is a living being, sensitive, almost intelligent. And it seems that it is much easier to keep the human being in the forest than in the city. One cannot hide from thoughts and emptiness in a forest. Robert tried, but it didn't work. He had the same dream over and over again. A blonde-haired boy of about 5 was swinging on a creaky old swing, flying higher and higher, into the sky clear of snow-white clouds, laughing merrily. And Robert admires this picture of serene happiness. The child turns around and shouts, "Daddy, Daddy, look how I can do it." The swing swings harder. He swings the child up to the crossbar some more and turns around, making a sunny day. "Son, be careful," she shouts at him, but the boy doesn't hear. Or maybe he just wants to show his father all his courage and daring. The swing swings up into the sky, stops for a moment, and slowly comes down again, as only happens in dreams. But the sun is no longer on it. "Jacob, Jacob, son, come back," cries Robert and wakes up in a cold sweat from his own cry. The dream repeats itself over and over again. And each time he fails to stop his son, to grab him by the arm, to pull him away from the cursed swings, to save him from impending disaster. Only sleep has its own laws. Strangely, Slagda has not dreamed for a long time, and Jacob, her son, who was never born. He dreams all the time down to the smallest detail, and his voice is cheerful, jovial. It is in Robert's ears for a long time. Maybe that's why he longs for the silence in the forest. Robert walked lightly along the usual route, with his rifle on his shoulder and a bag of provisions on his belt. There was water and bread at the water tower. Everything he needed to keep himself in good shape he found easily in the forest. Mushrooms, berries, nuts, all kinds of small game, stray hares, trapped spring water. He took it and used it. The only thing he never learned to do without was bread and coffee. The latter, of course, is a luxury. But as she got used to it during the years of her civilized life, she still does it. He could not feel well without a cup of drink in the morning. The inhabitants of the neighboring villages replenished his bread and other things. The fame of the miraculous village doctor, who had taken up residence in an empty forest cabin, spread rapidly through the area. Walkers from all the surrounding villages flocked to the forest. Understandably, the journey to the village was long and expensive. But there was a doctor on site. Robert was angry at first, but his conscience would not allow him to refuse. It was his fault. He saved a leg once. A foolish poacher got caught in his own trap. He was overjoyed to hear of a medicine man who had come out of nowhere in the local wilderness. So they came to him with their ailments and illnesses. How could they refuse when they had taken an oath? Of course, he would not accept money for treatment. And where do the villagers get the money? They themselves live on wild foods. So they brought bread and milk. Coffee was another story. One night, Robert awoke to a sharp knock on the door. "It's not locked," cried Robert, groping with his feet for the clipped Felenki. The door burst open and the threshold was blocked by 2 burly men in leather jackets, holding a third who was almost dangling between them. "Are you a doctor?" wheezed the taller one. "Help him die, brother." Robert knew at once that they were bandits. There was no fear. He had long considered himself a fatalist. Running from death was an exercise in futility. The bony one would find him in due time anyway. And before his time came, not a hair would fall out of his head. Besides, the wounded man was really bad. His face was pale. He must have lost a lot of blood. Robert quickly placed a clean sheet on the oak table and sent him over here. The bullet passed quickly. It was scary to watch the blood flow, but he was glad nothing vital had been damaged, rinsed the wound, pulled out a needle and assessed it. He looked at the victim. Weak, certainly, but it should hold. And they have no other options. "No anesthesia, we'll have to settle for local," Robert said and poured illegal alcohol into a glass. He didn't drink alcohol, but he had been offered some as payment for his treatment. He accepted it, no offense. It would be less of a burden and would do him good. Maybe it would do him good for the anesthesia. The wounded man opened his cloudy eyes with difficulty. Making an effort, he raised his head. He drank the live fire, closed his eyes with a gulp, and barely groaned, while Robert stitched the edges of the wound. 20 minutes later, he was finished. He assessed his work. He added a locally made herbal salve, and he bandaged the wound with strips of an old sheet. All night long, the wounded man was delirious, screaming, calling for a drink, calling for someone. Robert didn't sleep a wink. He was on guard, putting the palm of his hand to his flaming forehead. By morning, the fever had broken. The bandits had disappeared, just as they had appeared, as if they had vanished into the night. A couple of weeks later, Robert heard the knocking again. It was William. That was the name of the wounded man. And he wasn't the last in the local mafia hierarchy. William, however, turned out to be an interesting man, quite polite, an excellent conversationalist. He had been supplying the noble beverage to the Woods personally and through his handmaidens ever since. It was not instant coffee powder, but real coffee beans. It was a pleasure to grind it in an old grinder found in the woodcutter's house, and then brew it in a tin carafe to enjoy its aroma. In the absence of turkey, William gave it to Robert, and so life went on. If it weren't for thoughts, the damned thoughts that keep me awake even in this voluntary hermitage. Robert went down to the spring at the bottom of the ravine, and if you didn't know that there flowed a sweet, clear, living water there, your teeth would ache, and you would never guess where the spring was so completely hidden by the thicket of the cheerful little spring. Robert stumbled upon it by chance while wading through the thicket in search of prey, almost collapsing into the bushes. Then, now appreciating his find, he cleared a path, dug some comfortable steps, and replenished his supplies here daily. It was always cool by the water, and one could afford to rest, think, relax. He had just bent down to fetch some water when a suspicious noise up there made him crouch and lurk. His keen instincts and a lifetime of experience had taught him to fear beasts less than humans. The place is isolated. The branches intertwined to form a tent, so it was unlikely to be seen by intruders, whoever they were. Robert listened. The two kept talking. Or do we leave one here wheezing? I wasn't hired to carry carrion on my back. The second one cut in. You should have dug in at once, not started that educational process. I told you to figure it out, to suffer until the last second. Now we'll tie her to a tree so she can learn something for her future. The first said admonishingly, "We've already taught her that." The second laughed. "All of us. More than once. Hey, you're drooling, you're going to have to pick up first. I don't think he's breathing anymore. Why don't we just leave it at that?" He was silent for a minute. "She's not alive," the first one declared. "I wish she were dead," said the second. "I can see you're pitiful." Cut the first one off. Let's get out of here. We've done our job. Robert waited a little longer and climbed cautiously. The bandits were gone. He looked around and saw the trunk of an old pine tree wrapped in ropes. Rounding the tree, he found the girl coiled and motionless, her head down. She hung half a meter above the ground. His whole body was covered with bruises. Her face was swollen and her hair hung in dull locks. "Why did you have to be like that?" muttered Robert. At that moment, the unhappy woman moaned softly. She was indeed still alive. Robert pulled out his knife and sawed through the thick rope, dropping it on the grass. When was it over? The girl fell slumped in his arms. She gave no sign of life. She must have fainted. He had no choice but to carry her on his back and drag his terrible find toward the house. The girl was thin and petite, but appeared heavy in her unconscious state. However, athletic conditioning and a healthy lifestyle made the former city dweller stronger, and an hour later she loaded her burden onto the washed bed. Robert's hands began their examination. The girl had been badly beaten, most likely beaten with hands and feet. And if he remembered the words of the bandits, she had been roughed up on top of that. She didn't seem to have any fractures on her. At least with this one there was luck. Robert carefully treated the wounds. He prepared a miraculous mixture from his own recipe. At least all the locals spoke of the power of his ointment. Who has had the opportunity to try its effects? And William, too, I remember, had an effect by bandaging it with strips of cloth. Another sheet was used for that purpose. If this went on, she would have nothing to sleep with. Wrapping her up like a baby made a dipper of herbs and painkillers, and anti-inflammatories. Well, the first aid had already been administered. The rest depended on the strength of the body. Robert sank onto a stool, took a sip of tea to replenish his strength, and waited. His guest slept for 24 hours. He was on duty near her, leaving only to go to the bathroom. He guessed she was awake by a faint moan, lifted her head, gave her some potion, and put her back to bed. "You need more sleep," Robert told the patient. "It's the best thing in your condition." Her swollen lips parted. She was evidently trying to speak. Her swollen eyelids fluttered open, but she could not open her eyes. The fever had gone down. He determined this by touching his forehead with the palm of his hand. "Sleep to sleep," he repeated and went outside. "Well, you're in trouble, Robert," he told himself. "The last thing you need is a gang fight. What if they happen to check the results of their exemplary punishment? What if the girl has disappeared? If they start combing the woods, they're both dead." He understood the danger, and that he should have left the poor girl to die in the forest, and how he would live then without thinking about anything. Robert returned to the house. The girl was already asleep again, moaning now and then in her sleep. Thanks to the herbs, the pain had subsided. Of course, one could not keep the patient on them all the time. It could become addictive. Hopefully, he would have a young body and a will to survive. He spent another couple of days in the same therapeutic oblivion. Robert gave her a spoonful of water to lift her head, dressed her, and she went back to sleep. For her natural needs, she used a pot found in the loft, washed it, dried it to avoid sores and festering. Robert performed all these unpleasant procedures with the patience and indifference of an experienced nurse, without disgust or irritation. The girl seemed to be in a kind of prostration, unconscious of what was wrong with her and where she was. Perhaps it was for the best. She would remember later, of course. And he, of course, is not a psychologist. Otherwise, he would have helped himself to go on with the memories. On the third day, he woke up and ordered a drink. His voice was barely audible. Robert guessed rather than heard his request. He served her broth with a spoon. He had no chicken on hand. But the hare would do too, after she had drunk a few spoonfuls of hot broth. The girl lay helplessly back on the pillow and wheezed. "Where am I?" "In the forest, at the woodcutter." Robert smiled. "Welcome to the world of the living. They're looking for me." Mustering her strength, the girl whispered. Robert shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know. So far, everything is quiet. There's a chance they won't check the results. Dead is dead." "Why did they do this to you?" The girl closed her eyes and turned away. Was he faking it? So as not to answer the question, or maybe she had really fallen asleep. Robert looked closely at her face for the first time. The swelling had gone down. The bruises no longer covered her face so much, and it was now clear that she was very young and even attractive. Footsteps were heard on the other side of the window. She jumped up, scolding herself for her carelessness. The door burst open and William entered, unannounced as usual. And how could he announce his visit with pigeons in the mail? Robert's cell phone remained in that previous life. There was no need for it here. William looked around. His gaze landed on the body of the bed. He nodded his head. Apparently he wasn't the least bit surprised. "You're a lucky man, brother. Who else would have stumbled upon a girl in the woods and dragged her to them? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into without a clue?" Robert shrugged, pointing to a chair. "I think you're about to enlighten me, aren't you?" William sat down on a stool, pulled out a can, a coffee, a sausage stick. "The whole county is buzzing about how James punished his wench to teach the others a lesson." "What did he do wrong?" asked Robert with a knife, opening a can of stew and putting chunks of meat on a slice of bread. "Is it a right you're trying to claim?" William shook his hand. "I wanted to run away. I wanted to be free. I wanted to run away. I wanted to be free. I used to be happy with everything. Clothes, expensive trinkets, all kinds of complexes. money. I spared nothing for her, even got her out of court. Don't look at her like that. All angelic and bloody with it. She hit a woman. She must have been drugged or drunk, if she didn't know how to drive and got behind the wheel. That's the result. She didn't know how to drive. She didn't have time to brake right at the intersection and hit her. And a pregnant woman, too. 2 lives for one idiot. Do the math. I heard the husband was seeking justice for a long time, only it never even made it to court. They closed the case. Robert's face went white, slammed his fist on the table. So the banks jumped. There is no such thing as coincidence. Yes, fate has a way of playing cruel jokes. It was my wife and my unborn child, dry-lipped, whispered. I had gone through all the courts demanding that the murderer be punished, but I got nowhere. They hushed up the case and hinted at me not to get involved. So I went into the woods. I stayed in the cabin. Then I saved the killer. William rubbed the back of his neck. That's quite a twist. So maybe this is a chance for justice. I've got a jeep nearby to load up the bastard and take James. I mean, he already sent his boys after her. He wanted to make sure she was dead. They went back into the woods and the girl was long gone. But of course they freaked out. They lied that she was dead. They dug up the body in the woods, but don't remember where. Only James wasn't stupid, even though he was totally frozen. He suspected something was wrong. They'll look for her, dead or alive, and they'll find her. Do you have any idea how this is going to turn out? Does he need her? Robert was silent. All the pain he had repressed for years rose from the bottom of his heart and swept through his mind in a tidal wave. He was carrying the killer of his beloved wife and unborn child. He had rescued her, healed her wounds, coddled her, and now it was his will to avenge it all at once. Why is he hesitating to make a decision? Is he willing to risk his life? By beating the bandits of this girl who ruined his whole life? I can't. So, looking down at the table at his whitened knuckles and muffled fists, he told her God has sent me to the middle of the forest to help her. Who am I to go against a higher will? William sighed noisily, stood up and looked out the window. You are a fool, brother. That's how you're a fool. I only remember the good. You brought me back to life. I owe you one. I'm going to see if I can talk to those guys. I wouldn't put myself in danger for a rotten girl. She is paying for her sins. And she doesn't deserve to be eradicated for the second time in her life. The girl lay quietly on the bed in the corner, perhaps asleep, but more likely lurking. Frozen in terror, it wasn't clear who she feared more now, her tormentors or her savior. No need to meddle in this matter, William. Robert looked seriously at the bandit, who was clearly willing to risk not only his reputation, but his life for him. It is my responsibility. I've been sent a test. You have nothing to do with it. Are you a religious man or something? Asked William. Robert shrugged his shoulders. I'm a doctor. We believe more in science than in the hand of God. I've seen it happen, though. Sometimes people come back from the other side of the world, except for some miracle. There's no explanation for that. But I lost faith when I lost my wife and son. Why them? What was their fault? William stood up, patted her on the shoulder, then looked out the window, peered through the trees and sighed. I told you you should have put the child in the car and taken her to her master. It's too late now. We've got company. Do you have a gun? Robert nodded to the old double-barreled stock he had inherited from the woodsman. William shook his head derisively. Yeah, a gun like that would make you shit your pants. He laughed. Well, you just sit there and keep your nose to the grindstone. I'll try to settle this peacefully. I'll go with you. Robert started up, but backed away with a fierce look on his face. William was not a bad man. He had his principles, but he was still a bandit, a man who lived by his own laws. I said, wait here. He barked and went out, closing the door behind him. Robert moved the old chest of drawers and closed the entrance by boarding up the window. He realized that the gatehouse was not a fortress. It could not withstand a siege, but he had to do something. He was depressed by inaction. William, however, was also right, that he could die a hero's death against the bandits. The girl groaned. He turned to her frightened eyes, swollen with bruises. They stared at him in horror. Don't move, he ordered her. She was to blame. However, she was only throbbing with fear. Robert poured water and gave her a drink, holding her head, his teeth tapping the rim of the glass. Taking a sip or two, the girl dropped her head back on the pillow and fell silent. Then she heard, or perhaps guessed, that he was whispering something. She leaned over to listen. "Give it back. I deserved it. Let them kill me." Silence. He commanded with a lip, and she fell silent again. The minutes of waiting were long and weary. No shots were heard. This meant that William managed to negotiate peacefully for the time being. Then Robert heard the doorknob rip from outside, and William's voice was heard. "Open up. It's me." Robert pushed back the dresser. William came in, laughing at the sight of the makeshift barricade, but he soon became very serious again. "So the guys we knew ended up chatting? That's what we decided. They didn't want to get in trouble because of a mutilated girl. They felt sorry for her, but James did not. So we had to do what they told him to do, and get a picture to prove it. Maybe they'll believe it." "Why are you looking at me like that?" The gentleman with the sad picture clenched his fists. "We'll make a mockery. You're the doctor. You know what a corpse lying on the ground for 24 hours must look like." Robert exhaled. Well, William was offering a way out, albeit a very questionable one. What if his patient died of fright and ended up in a grave? After all, why should he care? Hearing that, William turned back to the bed. "Get ready, you're going out, or rather, you're going out. Are you going to play dead? Do it convincingly. You'll have a chance at life. Although if I were Robert, I'd shoot you right here. Don't do it, she's scared enough as it is." Robert was indignant. There was no need to hide it. He had been wishing the killer dead for a long time. He seemed ready to cut him to pieces with his teeth, to tear him apart. And now he was looking at this tortured and battered girl, and he feels nothing but pity, intellectual softness, or Christian forgiveness. He wouldn't exactly answer that himself, but it was the only thing he could do. You heard what he said. He snapped at the girl curled up on the bed. "Now I'll take off your bandages. You'll have to pose with your clothes off. It can't be helped. The more convincing you are, the sooner the play will be over." "Not if you understand," she nodded. Tears welled up in her eyes, but Robert again repressed the treacherous pity in him. "What are the bandits doing there?" she asked William. He grimaced, and Robert realized he didn't like that word. How touchy and touchy they all were. Brothers, that's what they call each other. But all those who break the law, those who take property and money from people, even if they are rich, are bandits. Even William, and he is Robert the doctor. Whose duty is it to save people? Willing to help the bandits and participate in the show to save the life of a murderer. The world seems to have gone mad, and it's making a scene with him. That is, digging the grave, William explained, with a chuckle, preparing the corpse. "I think they've already done that." Robert approached the trembling girl. The girl clutched the bandages, tracing her plea. A glance asked William to step aside. "Are we so gentle?" He said, however, turning away. Robert unwound the bandages, making sure the young body had already begun to heal the bruises and wounds it had suffered. Yes, his entire body was still bruised, but it was not life-threatening. She unconsciously tried to cover her lower abdomen with her hand. Maybe she was embarrassed, but it was more likely that her insides ached. Okay with that later. She wasn't a gynecologist or a psychiatrist. Other than that, she was functioning well. It was noticeable, especially given the conditions of the field, or rather the forest. "I think it's over in there," William hurried. "Let's pack it up and take it to the grave. We need to get this part of the show over with. Then we'll figure out a way to hide it." "I've got it," Robert said briefly, in a tone that made William stare at him. The girl was silent and put up no resistance when she was wrapped in a sheet and taken out into the courtyard. Robert thought he heard the frantic beating of her heart. There, behind the trees, the two bandits were digging a hole. It was unlikely that they had entered the woods with a shovel and a spade. Looking at William, Robert realized that he had provided the equipment to the thugs. He took it from the barn, apparently. What a considerate partner he had. The men took turns shoveling the black dirt. Last time he didn't see any faces. He only heard voices. At first glance, the men didn't look very handsome. Probably not smart either. So they gathered in packs around the wolf leader, showing everyone, and especially themselves, how cool and important they were. But Robert and William looked on sullenly. They put their hands to their guns. "Calm down, brothers." William sounded calm, but Robert caught in his voice the warning murmur of a great beast, accustomed to small creatures obeying him. A reminder, for the faint of heart, this is Robert. He saved my life. And he has a right to that girl's life too. She owes him 2 lives. Everyone understands that. The bandits looked at each other. One Robert had marked for himself last time as evil. He spat at their feet. "As I said, bury the bitch, and it will be easier for everyone to decide," William repeated. "That's right. Then she won't show up anywhere," interjected the other. "You have my word, really," confirmed William. True, with some hesitation, looking at Robert. "No one will ever hear his name again," Robert said quietly. Somehow they believed it. There was no telling what they thought of him. Maybe they thought the man had gone mad and was going to keep his victim in the cellar, chained up. Torture her. Until she died, throw her in the back, the evil one ordered. He liked to command at least his partner. The girl didn't make a sound. Perhaps she had fainted in terror. At least her face was dead pale. The second of the bandits pulled out his phone and took a few pictures. No deal. William suddenly intervened. "It has to look like you're digging it up, not burying it." "Exactly." The bandit slapped his forehead. "Well, don't get me wrong, girlfriend," and shoveled a few shovelfuls of dirt into the hole with obvious pleasure. Then he jumped into the grave and scrubbed. The supposed admirer's face with greasy mud crawled out to admire his handiwork. Now that's a good one. Both were passionately filming the nightmarish spectacle with their phones. "That's enough." William jerked sharply. "Let's dig it out and bury the hole." He and Robert lifted the corpse and threw a sheet over it. The bandits buried the empty grave, spread sod, and even shoveled in a shovel just in case. "Clean it up, you assholes," William cursed under his breath. "Where would you get a shovel in the woods? Tell me you were digging with knives?" The 2 boys looked at each other in disgust. That they recognized that he was right. "Watch your words," William said to one of them, "or you might overdo it. The ground is soft. There's room enough for everyone, if you squeeze well. Try it," William suggested in a moment. And he had a gun in his hand. "What am I to you, William?" "Yes, I was joking." "Why are you backing out?" "Bandit. You can't take a joke. You can't joke with James, William. The photo shoot's over. You're free to go." And so was he. He nodded to Robert. "Didn't you see him?" They both nodded and walked away into the woods. William watched Robert for a while, squatting next to the girl. Alive asked as he lit a cigarette. Robert nodded instead of answering. "Too bad," William dropped briefly. "What are you going to do now?" "Are you going to heal?" Robert replied. "And then you'll know not to see her again." It was not William who was worried about himself. Robert was well aware of that. "No one will ever see her again. She is dead," he replied calmly to the boy. "Go away, William. Thank you for helping. Is there any light in you?" "I have a soul too. We could be friends." "You sound like you're saying goodbye," William wondered. Robert shrugged his shoulders. "Anything can happen. That's why I say what I think. You are a strange man." Robert shook his head at William and held out his hand. Robert shook his hand firmly. Without turning around, William walked away into the woods, to where his jeep was waiting for him at the edge of the forest. It was all over. "Don't be afraid." Robert turned to the girl. "I will take you inside and treat you. No one else will hurt you." It was easy. Robert managed without William's help. He didn't take her straight into the house. He laid her down on the grass near the porch, took some rainwater from the barrel. He began to wash her, cleaning the dirt from her body. She woke up, moaning, apparently trying to protest, but he shouted at her and the girl quieted down. When he had wiped all traces of dirt from the grave, Robert said, "You have been reborn. You have been buried, but you are not dead. So you have a second chance. Give it a try. If you don't, life might turn out well for you." She nodded without opening her eyes. And then she went limp, probably passed out from everything that had happened. "Wake up," asked Robert an hour later. The girl looked up from the bed. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. She pursed her dry lips and whispered Molly. Molly came out shaking her head. It was like a fairy tale. So Robert and Molly met at a bad time. Too bad it turned out to be a terrible fairy tale. I never did find out who was driving the car that hit my wife. They just said the girl was drunk. No name, no age. Not drunk. Every word was hard for her. Robert shook his head, lying. A sober one would have been able to stop. The girl shook her head. Were the brakes defective? She couldn't. Why did James give you a car and not check the brakes? Robert grimaced. Make up another story. It's a bit fanciful, isn't it? The girl tried to get up, sit up in bed. Her car was stolen. She tried to brake, failed. Why did she get behind the wheel if she can't drive? Robert was angry, but the girl looked so pathetic, so pleading. He wanted to believe for a second, but wanted to run away. I wanted someone to damage the brakes. If I had been behind the wheel, I would have crashed for sure. Wait a minute. Are you saying it was a coincidence? You stole a car where someone had deliberately damaged the brakes, said Robert in disbelief. The girl nodded. James was no fool. He would have figured it out right away. Robert still couldn't believe it. That second car rarely drove. He ran out of strength, and the girl stretched out on the bed. Robert thought that all these years he had imagined the killer as a spoiled brat who didn't know how to drive, who didn't brake properly at the crosswalk. Now the situation seemed different. Unless, of course, he was lying. He went to a lot of trouble to get you off. Everyone said James was shaking his maid, no expense spared. And you're telling me he was thanking you for saving his life at the expense of two innocents. Robert finished. Clenching her fists, Molly shuddered and whispered, "Why didn't you kill him?" Said you can't forgive. Because the doctor is supposed to save us, not kill us. So you wouldn't get in the way of the bandits. They'd be fine. His quiet voice was almost a whisper of utter hopelessness. I'm human too, as it turns out, Robert cut in. All right, that's enough confessions for today. Tell me where it hurts. My whole body hurts. Inside is the worst. She put her hand on her lower abdomen and burst into tears. Robert turned away. There was nothing he could do to help her live with it. Drink this. It's a decoction of herbs. It has painkillers and sedatives. He handed her the cup. Molly drank greedily in large gulps. Then she looked at Robert again. What's going to happen to me now? Pathetically, she asked. He shrugged. I gave my word you'd disappear. I know you wouldn't like what I have to say, he shrugged. But I couldn't think of anything else. I'll take whatever you want. He resigned himself. My life is in your hands. All our lives are in someone else's hands. Robert shook his head. And you have no idea how many times I've asked you to die. I saw you in the grave and I was horrified. But I can't forget that you had Clara killed, that I will never see our son again. I can't. I understand. Molly responded meekly. For as many lifetimes as I have left, I will ask your forgiveness. God will forgive, Robert said quietly, watching her face. But she was already asleep again. The conversation must have sapped her of all her strength. Robert moved a stool closer to the bed, put a cup of water and a loaf of bread. Even if she woke up before he got back, she wasn't going anywhere. And he needed to gather his thoughts and pull himself together. Robert went to the river. It was his favorite place for solitary contemplation. The river carried its calm, clear waters unhurriedly. It was an unusually good place to think, as if the river carried away worries and doubts. And there, on the other bank, on a hillock, stood a small, lonely monastery, very old, with no gold in its dome with a fallen cross. Robert had seen it when he decided to settle here. The villagers told me that the nuns sometimes came by boat to the village, very rarely in case of emergency. In the memory of the farmer who had initiated the conversation about the monastery. It had only happened once, when the roof of the temple had fallen in, ruined by the weather, and the nuns had asked for help, anyone who knew how to do carpentry. So the villagers flocked by boat and returned at dusk, for the men of the convent were only willing to tolerate as laborers. They did not work for money. Where would it come from? For bread, and more for the dye that the nuns made excellent. However, when paying for it, the nuns told the workers not to abuse it. They swore, baptized, and then, of course, repented for not holding back. The second time, the monastery needed a doctor. That's how Robert met Kelly's mother, a beautiful woman who was already in her 60s. An imperious woman, under whose gaze even he was ashamed as a schoolboy of the townspeople, he told her. The hermit doctor and the abbess visited him personally in the Forest Gatehouse. It was indeed a serious matter. The sisters could cope with ordinary ailments, although they had all the necessary medicines at their disposal. But they could not cope with a purulent angina accompanied by severe swelling. And it was a long way to the nearest town. And by the time they found transportation, they would have wasted their time. And so it was, as it later turned out. There was another good reason. The sisters and novices did not want to communicate with the outside world. Most of them not only decided to come closer to the faith and take refuge in the monastery from all temptations, they also had a difficult relationship with the law. There were wives who hid from tyrannical husbands. There were repentant drug addicts who had nowhere to go. Mother Kelly welcomed them all. And not once had anyone been heard of being turned away from the cloister of the Virgin Mary. Robert suspected that Mother Superior's past might also have revealed pages that she probably wouldn't want to make known. But these were only his speculations. The boat seemed to be in place. It was tied to a stake protruding from the sandy shore. What a paradox. The locals are drinkers, but no one touched the boat. Turns out these people had already sunk almost to the bottom. There was something sacred left. I arrived at the monastery and stopped at the gate in about 40 minutes. The temple was low. The old one had been repaired 100 times. It seemed to be kept alive only by the word of God. But it endured. Stopped at a gate, crossed at crossroads. Dome already rushed to him, stern gatekeeper. "Good morning, good mother," he greeted her. "I would like to speak to Mother Superior." "I'll go and fetch Mother. Don't let me pass the gate." Robert nodded sympathetically and did not remember being let in much further the last time. But there was a special need there. The woman could have died without medical intervention. He was now an ordinary beggar, so he would wait. He sat down on the grass with pleasure. I looked around and saw how well the farm was managed. The sisters lived pleasantly. Every piece of land is adapted to the needs of the monastery. There is a vegetable garden. There is a pond, secure, stocked. They do not need entertainment. They have a special job: to pray to save the world, to cleanse their own sins and the sins of others. Mother Kelly walked quietly toward him. She looked around and said, "Peace be with you, Robert. I see we have a serious talk, so let's talk. I am tired today. I've done everything I set out to do. I thought I'd take a walk. Let me lean on you and get away from the temple. Sisters are pious, but women must not give in to temptation. Curiosity is also a sin." The Mother Superior took him under her arm. Only now did Robert realize that he was limping a little. Tracking his gaze, Kelly smiled. "Let it go. The years take their toll. There's no cure for old age, and they gave me the letter as a reminder of my pride." Robert asked no questions. He didn't answer, nor did he initiate conversation. He waited to collect his thoughts. She listened to his story and thought for a long time. Then she said quietly, "The Lord himself has kept you from vengeance. He has withheld it. Can you forgive me from your heart?" "I don't know," Robert confessed sincerely. Even now, as he learned of the circumstances that had led to the tragedy, he could not see Molly at peace. Only her helpless state appealed to his duty as a physician. She is the one who agrees to live with us, to isolate herself from the world. Kelly asked again. "I haven't told her everything." "More," Robert said. He seems to have guessed something. The abbess wondered. "Let us decide," she said at last. "If he comes to us of his own free will, we will accept him and give him another name. It is as if she were to die in her former life. For now, she will be a novice. Then we will see. If she gets scared, let her go. It is her destiny. You can't force her. She's been a plaything in the wrong hands against her will, I suppose. We'll take care of that. Now the other thing. I want about you, Robert about me," she wondered. The abbess looked into his eyes, and that gaze now seemed like an X-ray beam. "About you," confirmed Mother Kelly. What are you going to do with your life? Go on living my life? Robert shrugged. He had never thought about himself. He didn't have time, especially in light of recent events. It was like sitting in a lodge waiting for the bandits. Kelly smiled. What if they do? What if they think they've been tipped off? If the villagers get spooked, they'll show up. And they'll get the truth out of you with a pincer. Can I manage somehow? Said Robert stubbornly. Of course, he knew Mother Superior was right. It was a possibility. I can't hide it in my house, you know. At least a doctor would do the cloister good. Another suggestion would be to go to a men's monastery. Robert was sure he had guessed it, but no. The Mother Superior shook her head. You can't hide from your pain in any monastery. Go to the people, not only to the people, but to the most destitute, who are like clay. If in wicked hands the beast is set free, if in kindly ones there is hope, that man with riddles speaks. Matron shook her head. Robert. The abbess looked at him with pure, motherly eyes, and he felt the ice of anger at the denial of the world's goodness melt somewhere inside him, and a shy hope run through him. We'll take the one you ask for, Kelly repeated. But first, try to forgive her yourself. Yes, it's hard. Right now it seems impossible. Listen to her. Give her a chance to forgive herself. Then bring her back. Who knows if you will see her later? No one will be able to remove this stone from her soul, not even God himself. Now go, it is time. And the abbess walked towards the door almost without a limp. Her movements were light, almost dancing. And Robert wondered for a moment what she had been before in that worldly life, what she had given up to save the souls of the lost. The way back seemed quicker. Before entering the house, however, he cautiously peeked out the window to see if they were visiting. The image before him was mostly tragicomic. Molly had not just gotten out of bed. She had put on his shirt and pants and was trying to make the small room cozy. The room was noticeably cleaner. The glass had definitely been cleaned, and now she was scraping the pot that served to do both the former and the latter. It was still very weak. From time to time, he would stop to rest. Then he would resume his work. His face was pale and very concentrated. Suddenly, he would smile. A smile came over his face. He entered the house. Molly made a startled dash toward him, but he waved her to sit down. Thank goodness she was able to get up. It's a pity you're making such a fuss. You're not ready yet. I wanted to help. He didn't know what to do with his eyes, as if she were a spoiled child. He thought with annoyance that he couldn't hate her as much as he used to. The girl was so terrified that it would take an executioner to scare her even more. He sat at the table, facing her, staring at her point blank. Unable to bear it, he asked her the question that had been bothering him for a long time. How did you end up with James? You had to know he was a brute, a fearsome creature. Even his own kind are afraid of him. Why did you fall in love? Money, a gangster's roof. You're just a child. How old are you? 20-something. Can't you find a normal guy? I don't get it. Molly's eyes filled with tears. She paused, then lifted her chin, speaking softly. My parents sold me to him. No one asked me if I agreed or not. Robert looked at her silently for a moment, digesting the information. What are you talking about? She finally asked. How can you sell a living person in the 21st century? I was sold that way, Molly continued casually. Well, traded. James forgave my father his debt, and I stayed with him. He didn't even haggle much. What kind of father is that? Robert couldn't take it anymore. The story he was telling was too unbelievable. A father as a father, he shrugged. Actually, he was a trader, as he called himself, who had a few stalls in the market and paid pennies to the traders and a lot to James for the roof. At first, all went well, but then greed set in. One day, he was left with someone else's winnings. Lots of temptation. He wanted a newer car, a bigger apartment. At first, he got away with it. But then they came at him, and he was several $1,000s in debt. James offered a trade. He was 17 years old at the time. Apparently, he liked the quiet girl. An outstanding student, good-looking. He thought it would be fun to have a toy like that. And your father said yes. What he'd heard didn't make sense. But Molly spoke so calmly, without any emotion, that somehow he believed her. She wasn't lying. She wasn't lying. He could tell. She was nodding. And who wouldn't? James didn't just want to take the money. He wanted to punish him so others wouldn't be punished. He said they would put my mother and me in a circle and burn the market. He also agreed with the floor. And then what happened? What for? Asked Robert. William told him about James and his outrages. It was an unpleasant portrait. Then Molly repeated thoughtfully. Then the old me died and went to hell. He's a real sadist with complexes. He has to demonstrate his power. He was demonstrating his power. I soon realized he would never let me go. And then what? Robert saw how hard it was for him to say I could. He shrugged his shoulders. Molly started looking for ways to spoil his pleasure. Most of the time they got drunk. Liquor was readily available in the house. It amused him. At least he didn't remember everything. That was my life. Molly spoke so calmly that Robert could tell she was burning up inside. He imagined himself for a moment in her place for 17 years. He had his whole life ahead of him, and all that awaited him was pain, mistreatment, and thoughts of death. Yet he was very fond of me in his own way. Molly continued, looking down at the table. Apparently that was the only way he could do it. You see, women came and went, and I was still his favorite toy. A dog on a chick. I was always there for him. Did he want to be with me at night, or did he want to beat me up? Robert shuddered. What happened the day you hit Slag? He asked quietly. Did you tell the truth about the breaks? Molly looked at him with the expression of someone who has nothing left to lose. Yes, I told the truth. Several times I tried to run away. They brought me back and punished me. Only he didn't realize that, while he was healing me, he didn't want to touch me. And that was all I wanted. I stopped drinking completely. And that day, I decided that I would rather die than run away. I could walk anywhere on the property, like the owner's dog, as long as I didn't jump the fence. I thought of everything beforehand. I pulled into the garage, started flirting with the guards, asked permission to sit in the car. James hardly used it. The other was away on business. They said it was okay, as long as I drove it naked. I said yes. I unbuttoned my blouse. As they looked at me, I started the engine and drove straight at them. Before they knew it, closed the garage. It's a powerful car. It tore down the fence in one fell swoop. I had a cloudy thought in front of my eyes. I am free. Only then did I realize I couldn't brake, so I drove into the crosswalk. I heard a scream, then I hit a pole. I don't remember anything else. I woke up in the hospital with James sitting next to me. He told me I had hit a pregnant woman. I thought he was going to kill me. I was glad I didn't have to suffer anymore. But he found the best of actors to get me out of the trial. He was so glad I was driving and not him. His brothers later recounted that the case ended in a serious confrontation. The one who had messed up the brakes on the orders of, let's say, a rival gang, was punished. I saw what was left of him and never tried to escape again. I was quiet for a few years, and James called me his pet and told me it was the only way I could get away with it. How did you decide to run away again? Asked Robert quietly. She was telling him parsimoniously, but he could imagine the hell she'd been living in for years. Molly shrugged. She had made up her mind. I had guests, and they'd all been drinking. I hid in the trunk of one of the cars, only I didn't get very far. James raised the alarm, and they brought me back. Then they grounded me. Molly wrinkled her nose, involuntarily covering her stomach. You know the rest. They were silent for a few minutes, each thinking about something else. There's a women's convent across the river, said Robert. I've spoken to the Mother Superior. She wants you to live there. It's a quiet place. No one will harm you. I don't think the bandits will look there. The girl looked at him, tears in her eyes. I agree. She said in a very low voice, Day and night I will pray for my sins. Maybe I can ask for forgiveness. If everyone has decided to go, let's go. Let's not waste time. Molly asked no questions. They walked slowly. After all, she was still very weak. Her figure in the baggy shirt and rolled-up pants looked comical. Only what else could Robert offer his unwilling guest and patient? Down by the river, he cut the boat. He helped Molly across and made herself comfortable. She stared out at the water. Her lips whispered something. And he thought that still river was a watershed for both of them. separating the life they had had before from the one they were both entering now. It took them much longer to reach the monastery. Molly stared at the crosses without looking away. It was as if she was magnetically drawn to them. Robert was silent, giving her a chance to say goodbye to this familiar, if very cruel, world. Was he right to decide his destiny in this way? And who could give the answer? Only time, which will put everything in its place and judge everyone. Two silent nuns came to the door to say goodbye to Molly. The abbess stayed with Robert. "She's falling apart inside," she said thoughtfully, and Robert understood what she meant. He nodded his head. Such wounds take decades to heal. Kelly sighed. "She won't be here for the rest of her life. He may go out into the world. But I can't take that back. We'll talk about you now." She handed Robert a piece of paper with an address on it. "It's the address of a juvenile facility. It's not far. You'll be there soon. I've already arranged for your admission. The children will stay there in the convent, and they often need a doctor. They all have different ailments. The monks take care of their souls, and you will treat their bodies too. If you agree, of course." Robert smiled at Mom. He said he had already agreed. "How can I refuse?" "Then don't refuse," Kelly said amicably. "Consider this medicine I've prescribed for you. It's penance too, and you have a soul to heal." "Thank you, Mother," Robert said, clutching the address in his hand. She nodded, crossing affectionately with him in farewell, looking majestic in her black robe and dancing face. Even with an apparent limp gait, Robert suddenly remembered the one who reminded him of the sudden disappearance of a prominent dancer who had become the mistress of an important politician. For a while, a rumor had been in the papers. Could it be her? However, he wasn't about to ask any questions about it. Robert folded his arms and looked up at the dome of the temple. "You're here, aren't you? You hear me, Father. Guide me on the right path. Comfort my sorrows, give me strength to go on living. I am not bitter." He kept the man in him. And at that very moment, the clear peal of bells filled the whole neighborhood. It floated over the monastery, over the field, over the forest, over the river, and the heart responded to the call, and as if the dust flew from the soul and suddenly became so light that it seemed about to wave its arms, rise from the ground and fly. "Thank you, Father." Robert folded his arms once more and walked away. Without turning around again, he walked as confidently as if all his questions had been answered. He was greeted warmly. He was asked no questions. Apparently, it was Kelly's recommendation. It turned out to be enough to get him work, shelter, food, and a paycheck. What was it? There was plenty of work in the infirmary. The asylum housed a dozen or 4 kids, ranging in age from infants to teenagers. He was treated for bruises and contusions, cuts and pustules. He was visited for contusions, cut wounds, pustules, and suspected tuberculosis. Behind every patient was his story, sometimes terrifying. Many had literally been saved from poverty, virtual slavery, humiliation, and even death by the brother monks. Every day, Robert saw so much pain, so much unchildlike despair, that his own suffering and misery took a back seat. He often had long conversations with the moon-gray abbot of the monastery. He turned out to be a friend and spiritual mentor to Mother Kelly. They talked about all sorts of subjects, and Robert found that he was attracted to this wise man. A man full of worldly wisdom, Robert never became a churchman in the full sense of the word. Sometimes, when he was drawn to it, he would line up at services and listen to the words of prayer, but more often he would approach the icons. When the church was empty, he spoke alone with God. He was respected by the monks and even by the wolf pupils, who regarded him with suspicion. Dr. Robert was said to be a normal man. They did not come to him just for ailments, but to talk to him. He willingly gave the children tea with sweets bought with his salary. Even if it wasn't much, he had nothing to spend it on. Thus, 6 months passed. Robert was sure he had finally found his place in the world and his destiny. But one bleak autumn morning, 2 equally bleak aunts from social services brought the baby home. They had appeared earlier on the convent grounds, delivering the new arrivals, now bellowing and obstinate, now cursing and shouting, now indifferent. Robert saw the car arrive and thought with a sigh that the orphanage would be full of residents. The good thing is that they were picked up, taken off the street, or taken away from parents who were drunk out of their minds. Too bad. What's next? The child grows up without a loving mom and dad and learns to survive among his own kind. Politicians who advocate closing orphanages hardly think about who else would want these skinny, ugly, sick children. Adoptions are often of babies. They pick them out like baskets of puppies or kittens. They look for the cute and smart ones. And who wants these? Robert, look at the child. A thick bass interrupted his musings. In the doorway stood a gentle giant with the clear eyes of a startled child. Brother Liam, his assistant, also known as a cook and cleaner. He's also the best nurse in the world. A fine soul. But he has found no use in the world. He's gone to God. Maybe that's true. She held the hand of the child welfare aunts had brought. Robert looked at him and shuddered. It was the child from his recurring dream. The one who always flew up into the sky on the swing. The one who called him Daddy. "What's your name, little boy?" he asked softly, already knowing what he would hear in response. It said Jacob, 5 years old. Liam's brother looked at the piece of paper. "So you're Jacob." Robert bent down. The boy was still staring at the ground, not looking up. He didn't speak. He explained to Liam and beckoned to Robert with a finger. He followed him to the door. In front of him, his father killed his mother in a whisper, Liam's brother explained. And then he himself went to the other world. Jacob had been hiding in the closet the whole time. For 3 days, until the neighbors got worried, they could barely get him out. He struggled, scratched, mooed. He hasn't said a word since. That's where the grief lies. God, how could you let this happen? Terrified, Robert thought. He went back into the office and asked, trying to speak softly and gently. "Jacob, show me your tongue, please." The boy complied without complaint. Robert examined her throat, listened to her heart, and checked her lungs. There were no visible injuries on his body, except that he was incredibly thin. You could count all the ribs. Physically, he's healthy. Robert's verdict. I can't tell you what's going on inside his head. We'll keep an eye on him as long as he stays in the infirmary. Brother Liam nodded approvingly and left. Then Jacob, you will be here for the time being. In a cheerful tone that he found difficult, Robert said, "Pick a bed and make yourself comfortable." The boy looked around and made his way to the last bunk. Reluctantly, he sat down on it. Robert winked at him. "It's yours now, so make yourself comfortable." The boy didn't move. He remained seated and staring at one point. Robert sighed and walked away toward the office where he kept the reception desk, leaving the door open. Let him get used to it. Surely he didn't have time to talk now. His gaze fell on the teddy bear on his desk. He didn't know how it had ended up here. Maybe it belonged to one of the residents or someone who had worked here before him. Robert had been told that old Stephen had worked here into his old age. He was also buried here. He was mourned by the entire community. Many of his patients came to the good doctor's grave. It took a long time to find a replacement. Then fate intervened in the person of Mother Kelly. Looking at the cub, Robert winked at him and led him to the infirmary. "Jacob, look who's here to see you," he said. In conspiratorial tones, it's the bear, our most important doctor. The boy stirred. Impertinently, he reached out his hand to the toy and looked questioningly at Robert. "I guess he's your friend now," Robert nodded. "Can you tell him something?" He was a good listener. It takes away fears and grants wishes. If you whisper it in his ear, it's not all true. He's got it into his head to look at the child. He's a little boy. He doesn't know everything yet. Jacob picked up the bear cub and held him close. When Robert looked back through the open door half an hour later, he saw that the boy was asleep with his clothes on. Curled up in bed and cradling the bear cub in his arms. "Sleep, Jacob," whispered Robert. "Don't worry, sweetheart, nothing more will happen to you. I promise." Jacob stayed 3 days in the infirmary, and then they moved him to the shelter. Robert called him Kevin, a tall, athletically built boy. He was the leader of this motley crew and asked Kevin to keep an eye on Jacob. "You know, no teasing, no bullying. He's been through a lot. I can count on you, Kevin." He was flattered by the respectable doctor. He nodded gravely. "I'll look after the boy, you can be sure." And he kept his word. At least Robert hadn't heard Jacob cry once. Except at night, when he curled up on his pillow or slept. This he had been told in confidence by the younger boys, with whom the newcomer shared a room. He took the teddy bear with him everywhere. He was very obedient. He did everything he was told. The air and the quiet environment did him good. His ribs have turned pink, no longer sticking out so menacingly. The only thing that bothered everyone was that he never spoke. Apparently, the shock had been too severe, and the boy had withdrawn into himself, seeking refuge there, as in a tightly closed closet. Robert consulted psychologists. They even came to the shelter a couple of times and examined the boy. The verdict was always the same. The boy is mentally healthy. There are no visible abnormalities, but something prevents him from speaking. Robert went through the options, read the literature, and tried to talk to Jacob. The boy understood him, nodded shyly at first, then took him by the hand and followed him at every opportunity. Everyone was already used to seeing them together and didn't put up any obstacles to wordless communication. Even the boys, normally extremely jealous of this singling out of someone in the crowd, they pitied Jacob and didn't try to keep him away from Robert. Kevin protected him from the newcomers who didn't know the sad story of the sad blonde boy. Thus passed a year that brought great changes. Robert visited William. He was now a respected man. He was running for Congress, although he still wore the gangster's habit. He had the same Jeep, and his brothers became bodyguards. We don't know how he found Robert. I don't think Mother Kelly gave him up. William dispelled her doubts, however, explaining that she had simply instructed him to locate a doctor named Robert. He knew his approximate age. Robert's heart went cold when he realized that James could have found him the same way if he had wanted to. He shot James. He had gotten away with it. William said, looking around the infirmary. "So you can live with yourself. No one is going to hurt you. Have you heard from Molly?" Robert asked. William shrugged his shoulders. "I don't need to." "Did you tell me where you left the girl?" "I didn't ask then. I don't want to know now. Dad is dead, isn't it?" Robert nodded. But he wasn't fooling himself. Molly's fate did concern him. But he decided that no news was good news anymore and spoke of it no more. Not the mansion, of course. He had looked around and said, "So make a list of what you don't want. What do you need to be happy? What pills? I'm a servant of the people, and servants live better than masters. And I'm not going to invest my own money in the project to help disadvantaged children. That way there will be less for the scoundrels upstairs." William kept his word. Indeed, he took the orphanage under his patronage, and soon the infirmary was transformed into a cozy little hospital. Many of the smart kids even pretended to be sick, just so they could live there and have fun. However, it was hard to fool Robert. William's arrival was the definitive argument for the decision Robert had long been mulling over. After speaking with the rector and getting his blessing, he called William. The new deputy listened attentively and promised to help him. So all the paperwork was processed by them in record time. The adoption papers were signed without delay, and Robert suddenly became a father. He had no idea what to do in his new status. He didn't even dare to tell Jacob. He was suffering until he was called by the rector. "Would you like to be alone?" He advised him. Think of it as a short vacation. 5 days somewhere with nature, nothing in the way. You need a place that makes you feel good and relaxed. It will give you peace of mind, and it will be easier on the child. Robert didn't have to think long. So the two of them gathered their belongings and stuffed a teddy bear into Jacob's backpack. They set off for the land where this incredible story had begun. Once in the forest, Jacob was like a curious animal. He wanted to touch it, smell it, and taste it all. His wariness and reluctance disappeared from him in an instant. He frolicked like a puppy finally breaking free. Robert sighed happily at the thick scent of forest flowers and herbs. He was walking, untired, in a hurry, to get to the place. Memories came flooding back, plunging him into a deep reverie. He seemed to have lived here all his life. Here he could separate himself from it. He could allow himself to become a beast. Here he made the decisions that were most important to him. The forest had become his medical confessor, his judge. At the cabin he stopped. Something seemed strange to him. It seemed that someone had been in the house. "Wait, Jacob," he asked the boy, trying to speak softly, so as not to frighten him. "Stay by the house for a while." The boy obediently sat down on the grass and stared at an insect. Robert walked over to the house and looked out the window. There were visitors in the house, or rather, a guest. A woman dressed in a long skirt with her head covered with a shawl. She was sweeping the floor, humming. Her movements were quiet and leisurely. It was clear that she felt at home here. When she looked around, she saw Robert and squealed. At that moment he recognized her. "Molly, where did you come from?" asked Robert. "No more hiding." "And you are question for question," she replied. "Here we decided to come on vacation," Robert explained. "And sometimes I come to clean." "The house doesn't like to be left too long," Molly said quietly. She looked out the window. She saw Jacob and looked at him in surprise. "I'll tell you later," Molly replied briefly, setting the broom in a corner. She walked out of the house and stood next to Robert, not daring to ask any questions. She looked confused and frightened. At that moment, Jacob looked up and stared at her. "Mom," he said uncertainly, got up and walked toward her. He reached into the hem of her skirt and stood like that, clutching the hem of her skirt. "Jacob, son, have you spoken?" Robert was confused and delighted at the same time. Jacob turned to him and nodded. And there was such unthinkable happiness in his eyes that Robert was close to tears. "Why don't you call us to the table?" With surreal joy in his voice, he signaled to Molly. "Don't say anything now. We're tired from the road." I almost whispered with joy to Molly. "Come on, I've made potatoes. Hurry up." The potatoes were still warm and boiling in the same pot that a tired Molly took it upon herself to peel for good measure. It turned out to be a monastery potato. Robert marveled, and at the gleam of pride in his eyes. "I see I was wrong." "Yours from the orchard," Molly explained. "My mother lets me stay here sometimes. She says it's good for me. She says it's good for me." "What's wrong with being a nun?" asked Robert. "Molly." Mother shook her head. "Mother Superior won't let me take vows. She says live as long as you want, but your destiny is not here. Look for it while you still have time. So I'm out of here. I have to leave her." Jacob, catching the change in her mood, sniffed, grabbed her sleeve. "Mom's alarmed," he shouted. "We'll sort it out," Robert proclaimed, though his own feelings were upset. They spent the rest of the day doing simple chores. Robert sharpened his shovel. Molly fetched berries and fed Jacob. His scowling face was so funny that they both laughed. In the evening, leaving the reluctant Molly Jacob listening to the story, Robert went out into the yard, sat on the bench, and looked up at the sky. "Lord, what shall I do? Guide me. Give me a sign," he asked quietly. A drop fell on his face, followed by another. The rain mixed it all with tears, and the sun was shining in the sky. Blind rain is what it's called, I think. Robert blinked. When he opened his eyes again, he saw a rainbow, big as the sky. It's a sign. This is where I see my destiny. And these two lonely people, Jacob and Molly, are now my family, and I have to take care of them. Robert said quietly and breathed a sigh of relief. He got up from the bench and walked into the house. And from somewhere far away, across the river, came the quiet, melodious tolling of the convent bells.